a history of trans, homosexual, and bisexual relations, from acceptance to contention and back again. The history of transgender, homosexual, and bisexual identities and relationships reveals a complex interplay of cultural acceptance, societal repression, and political power. Across time and geography, these identities have been integral to human societies, often celebrated or tolerated in certain contexts and vilified in others. Shifts in attitudes toward acceptance or condemnation reflect not inherent moral truths, but the evolving priorities of power structures, religious institutions, and economic systems. This article traces these dynamics from ancient societies, where such identities were often unremarkable, through periods of intense persecution, to the modern era where acceptance and backlash coexist in a polarized world. Ancient societies, fluidity and acceptance. In many ancient cultures, transgender, homosexual, and bisexual relations were not only present but often integrated into social, religious, and political life. The realist lens views these societies not as utopian but as pragmatic, where gender and sexual diversity served specific cultural or spiritual functions, unburdened by modern binary frameworks. In ancient Mesopotamia, circa 3000 BCE, Gala priests, often described as gender nonconforming or transgender, served the goddess Inanna. These individuals, who adopted feminine pronouns and attire, performed sacred rituals and were revered for their liminal status, which was believed to bridge the human and divine. Sumerian texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh also depict same-sex relationships, such as the bond between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, which includes erotic undertones celebrated as heroic camaraderie. In ancient Greece, circa 800 to 300 BCE, homosexual relationships, particularly between men, were institutionalized in practices like pederasty, where older men mentored younger males in exchange for intellectual and sexual bonds. These relationships, described in Plato's Symposium, were not only tolerated but seen as vital to civic and military cohesion, as exemplified by the Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite military unit of male lovers. Bisexuality was similarly unremarkable, with figures like Sappho of Lesbos, circa 600 BCE, writing openly about love between women. Gender nonconformity appeared in myths, such as the androgynous deity Hermaphroditus, reflecting a cultural ease with fluid identities. Ancient India's Kama Sutra, circa 400 BCE 200 CE, and texts like the Mahabharata depict homosexual and transgender figures, such as the Hijra, who held roles as spiritual intermediaries. In Mesoamerica, Mayan and Aztec societies circa 200 to 1500 CE included gender-diverse individuals in religious ceremonies, while same-sex relationships were documented among warriors and nobility. Across these contexts, the absence of rigid monotheistic frameworks allowed for pragmatic acceptance, where diverse identities served social or spiritual purposes without threatening power structures. The rise of contention, monotheism, and colonialism. The shift from acceptance to contention often coincided with the rise of monotheistic religions and centralized power structures which sought to regulate bodies and behaviors to consolidate control. From a realist perspective, these changes were less about morality than about enforcing hierarchies that aligned with political and economic goals. In the Mediterranean, the spread of Judaism and later Christianity, circa 300 BC, 500 CE, introduced stricter sexual and gender norms. While early Hebrew texts like Leviticus condemned male same-sex acts, these were part of broader purity codes, not a blanket rejection of homosexuality. However, as Christianity became the Roman Empire's state religion under Constantine, 313 CE, it adopted a more rigid stance. Church fathers like Augustine framed non-procreative sex as sinful, aligning with Rome's need for population growth and social order. Transgender expressions, once tied to pagan rituals, were demonized as heretical, though figures like the Galli priests of Cybele persisted in some regions until suppressed. The Middle Ages, 500–1500 CE, saw homosexuality and gender nonconformity increasingly criminalized in Christian Europe. The Catholic Church's dominance, coupled with feudal hierarchies, prioritized rigid gender roles to ensure inheritance and labor reproduction. Sodomy laws emerged, with punishments ranging from penance to execution, though enforcement varied. Notably, same-sex relations persisted in monasteries and courts, often tolerated among elites until exposed for political leverage, as seen in the 14th century trial of the Knights Templar. The Islamic world during the same period was more ambivalent. While hadiths condemned sodomy, homoerotic poetry flourished in Persian and Arabic literature, and same-sex relationships were common in elite circles, as documented in the Book of the Thousand Nights and One Night. Transgender figures like the Mukanathan performed as entertainers in early Islamic courts, though their status waned under stricter interpretations of Sharia. The most significant rupture came with European colonialism, 15th to 19th centuries, which imposed Christian gender and sexual norms on colonized societies. In the Americas, Africa, and Asia, colonizers like Christopher Columbus and his successors encountered cultures with fluid gender and sexual practices, such as the Burdak, Two-Spirit among indigenous North Americans or Hijra in South Asia, and condemned them as savage. Spanish conquistadors, for instance, executed gender non-conforming Aztecs, while British colonial laws like the 1860 Indian Penal Code criminalized unnatural acts, disrupting centuries of acceptance. From a realist view, these crackdowns were not moral crusades, but tools to dismantle indigenous power structures and impose European control, aligning with economic motives like land theft and labor exploitation. The modern era: repression, resistance, and polarization. By the 19th century, the medicalization of sexuality and gender in Europe and North America further pathologized non-normative identities. The term homosexuality emerged in 1869, coined by Carl Maria Kurtbenny, but was quickly framed as a disorder by psychologists like Richard von Krafft-Ebing. Transgender individuals were labeled as inverts or transvestites, subjected to institutionalization or conversion therapies. These classifications, rooted in emerging scientific racism, served to regulate populations under industrial capitalism, where rigid gender roles ensured labor discipline and family units for workforce reproduction, yet resistance grew. In 1897, Magnus Hirschfeld founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in Germany, advocating for homosexual rights, while early transgender figures like Jenny June published autobiographies. The 1920s Weimar Republic saw thriving gay subcultures in Berlin, crushed by the Nazis, who sent thousands of homosexuals and gender non-conforming individuals to concentration camps. This pattern of progress and backlash recurred globally, driven by political shifts. For example, post-colonial nations like Uganda retained British sodomy laws, often amplified by nationalist rhetoric framing homosexuality as Western. The late 20th century marked a turning point. The 1969 Stonewall riots, led by transgender women of color like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, sparked the modern LGBTQ+ movement. Decriminalization followed in many Western nations: Canada in 1969, the UK in 1967 partially, and the US with Lawrence v. Texas in 2003. Transgender rights gained traction, with legal recognition of gender identity in countries like Germany, 1980, and Argentina, 2012. Bisexuality, long erased under binary frameworks, saw increased visibility through advocacy groups like BiNet USA in 1990. However, acceptance was uneven. Gains in LGBTQ+ rights often aligned with economic and political interests. Western nations embraced homo-nationalism, using gay rights to signal modernity while deflecting criticism of imperialism or inequality. Meanwhile, backlash intensified in regions where religious or nationalist movements wielded power. In Russia, the 2013 gay propaganda law reflected state efforts to consolidate control by scapegoating minorities. In Africa, evangelical Christian influence, often funded by U.S. groups, fueled anti-homosexuality laws, as seen in Uganda's 2014 legislation. The present: acceptance, backlash, and brazen opposition. As of May 12, 2025, transgender, homosexual, and bisexual relations occupy a paradoxical space. Globally, acceptance has grown. 36 countries allow same-sex marriage, and 70 recognize some form of gender transition. The World Health Organization declassified transgender identity as a mental disorder in 2019, and movements like India's Hijra-led advocacy have secured legal protections. Social media platforms like X amplify queer voices, fostering community and visibility. Yet backlash is increasingly brazen, driven by resurgent authoritarianism and religious fundamentalism. In the US, over 500 anti-trans bills were proposed in 2023 to 2024, targeting healthcare, sports, and education, often framed as protecting family values. These efforts, backed by well-funded conservative groups, exploit economic anxieties and cultural polarization to vilify marginalized groups. In Hungary and Poland, LGBT-free zones and bans on queer education reflect state-driven nationalism. In the Middle East, countries like Iran impose harsh penalties for homosexuality, though underground queer networks persist. The polarization observed in contemporary society does not merely reflect ideological divides. It unveils deeper, competing power dynamics that shape how queer identities are perceived and represented. Acceptance of these identities frequently aligns with neoliberal economies which commodify queer experiences for profit, exemplified by pride-themed corporate campaigns that often prioritize marketing over genuine support. This commodification places queer identities in a paradoxical position, celebrated during parades, yet marginalized in everyday realities, revealing the superficiality of such acceptance when coupled with economic interests. Conversely, the backlash against queer identities often serves the interests of authoritarian regimes, which utilize these sentiments as scapegoats, distracting the public from economic failures and consolidating their power by creating a common enemy. The rise of misinformation, particularly on social media platforms like X, acts as a catalyst in this struggle, propagating damaging tropes such as grooming and gender ideology. These narratives, frequently exacerbated by foreign disinformation campaigns, deepen societal tensions, illustrating how power can manipulate perceptions of identity to foster division and control. Historically, the trajectory of transgender, homosexual, and bisexual relations has been far from linear. It has oscillated through periods of both acceptance and oppression, shaped extensively by the prevailing power structures of the time. Ancient societies often embraced diverse identities when they served social or spiritual purposes, devoid of the rigid dogmas that emerged with monotheism, colonialism, and capitalism. These systems imposed an order designed to control populations and resources, creating friction whenever diverse identities challenged orthodoxy. Looking towards the future, the fate of queer identities hinges upon dismantling the systems that profit from division, be it through religious fundamentalism, nationalist scapegoating, or corporate exploitation. Achieving genuine acceptance necessitates more than mere legal protections. It demands a cultural metamorphosis that rejects binary hierarchies and embraces human diversity as an asset rather than a threat. This transformation is essential for ensuring that societal attitudes evolve not merely in response to the shifting winds of power, but from a collective moral awakening. As we navigate this complex landscape, the struggle for queer acceptance remains a battleground where victories, though hard-won, are never guaranteed. Only through concerted efforts to foster inclusivity and challenge the structures of oppression can we hope for a future where queer identities flourish, free from the shackles of exploitation and prejudice. The journey will be arduous, but ultimately it is one worth embarking upon, for the strength of humanity lies in its diversity, by Scott Young, aka Sin Famous Gamer.